Welcome to the Philosophical Life. In this episode, we're going to talk about the inductive problem of evil, or what's sometimes called the evidential problem of evil. It's a probabilistic argument against belief that God exists, namely that when you look at the amount of suffering in the world, the most likely thing to conclude is that there is no God. Welcome to the Philosophical Life. Today we're following this excellent introductory text by Ed Waringa, and it is got an excellent coverage, concise coverage of the problem of evil. Now, Waringa starts by noticing that this problem, this evidential problem of evil, really stems from William Rowe, in fact, a famous paper he wrote. Let's take a look at the argument. Premise 1. There exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Premise 2, an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Conclusion, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. Now, what sort of case could we make that an evil is unjustified? So here, William Rowe throws out a classic philosophical example. It's the example of the fawn trapped in the forest, burning up for no good reason. So here's the quote about this, and then we'll go into what it shows. There's a fawn trapped in a forest fire, quote, that lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. Rowe claims that, quote, as far as we can see, the fawn's suffering is pointless. And this sort of suffering could have been really easily prevented by an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good God. But Rowe takes this a step further. He says, even if you could come up with a reason, some kind of crazy reason like across the world something's going to happen, and it could only happen if for some reason that fawn suffered in that particular way. I don't even know what that would be. Again, it's hard to come up with a reason, but even if you could, here's what Rowe claims, quote, we must then ask whether it is reasonable to believe this of all the instances of seemingly pointless human and animal suffering that occur daily in our world. And he goes on and says, well, it seems quite unlikely that all the instances of intense suffering occurring daily in our world are intimately related to the occurrence of greater goods or the prevention of evils at least as bad, and even more unlikely should they somehow all be so related that an omnipotent, omniscient being could not have achieved at least some of those goods without permitting the instance of intense suffering that are supposedly related to them, end quote. Now, as Ed Waringa goes on to summarize, actually Rowe in later papers went on to sort of put his objection to theism in a little bit different form. It's very much the same spirit of that original formulation, but it kind of identifies and clarifies why this is an inductive problem of evil. So let's take a look at that. Premise 1. No good we know of justifies an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being in permitting the evil of the fawn's intense suffering, from which Rowe infers inductively. Premise 2, no good at all justifies an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being in permitting the evil of the fawn's intense suffering. And then from those two, he infers the following, therefore, there is no omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being. Now, the key claim and why this is inductive or probabilistic is that first premise probabilistically supports the second. What that means is if there is no good we can think of, no good we know of can justify the suffering of the fawn, then it's the case that no good at all justifies a God in permitting the suffering of the fawn. And given that there is such suffering, in fact, given that there are intense instances of suffering of animals and humans all around us in our day, every single day, it follows that there is no God. Now, recently, there's a view that has come to be called skeptical theism. Now, why is this view skeptical? Well, it's not skeptical of theism, which is it would be easy to misunderstand it that way. But it's skeptical of our epistemic position to know certain facts that God may know. That is, we can't really know whether or not the intense suffering of the fawn is, bringing about a greater good or preventing a worse evil. We can't know that. And given the fact that we can't know that, nothing follows from that about whether actually God does have such a reason. So given that we are limited in our epistemic capacity to know such reasons, it doesn't therefore follow that there are no such reasons. So this skeptical view, as you can imagine, blocks the inductive support from the first premise to the second. That is, you can infer from the fact that no good, or there's no reason that we know of that God would allow such a suffering, that there is no reason at all that God would allow such a suffering. So the skeptical bit in skeptical theism is it's skeptical about our ability to discern God's reason for allowing evil in specific situations and specific situations at all. That is, it is very, what you might call intellectually humble about our capacity to know God's reasons. And why is that? Well, if you think about it, if God is really all-knowing and all-powerful and wholly good, God will have reasons, at least it's reasonable to assume, God will have reasons that we really can't quite understand, given our cognitive limitations, given our power limitations, and given our, quite frankly, our moral limitations. We just won't understand some of God's reasons, and the fact that we have that limitation doesn't thereby cast doubt on God or make it unlikely that God exists. So the skeptical theist is going to push back against Rowe's claim that there are these unjustified evils, or the claim that Rowe knows there are these unjustified evils. And just because we don't see such a reason doesn't mean there isn't such a reason. In fact, as philosopher Alvin Plantinga has said, quote, "Why suppose that if God does have a good reason for permitting evil, the theist would be the first to know? Perhaps God has a good reason, but that reason is too complicated for us to understand, or perhaps he has not revealed it for some other reason." End quote. I hope you found this overview of the evidential problem of evil helpful, and I hope now you can see how the skeptical theist puts a wedge in the evidential problem of evil by claiming that the first premise doesn't probabilistically support the truth of the second premise and thereby support the truth of the conclusion. Keep thinking about religion deeply and keep living the philosophical life.